Hi everybody, welcome to History Calling and to the second video in my series on the 6 wives of Henry VIII. Today we're asking the question, when was Anne Boleyn born? As Henry's second and arguably most famous queen and the mother of Elizabeth I, you might think that her life was well documented, but in fact, although her death is famous, her birth is obscure. So that you can make up your mind about this little historical mystery, I'm going to take you through the known events of her life and the letter she wrote to her father, which should have solved the issue of how old she was, but which actually just threw up more questions than it answered. Please remember to like this video, leave a comment below, and subscribe to my channel with the little notification bell switched on so that YouTube lets you know every time I post new content. You can also follow me over on Instagram, where my username is @historycalling. Anne Boleyn's tragic end on a scaffold at the Tower of London is well known, but just how old she was when Henry disposed of her remains hotly debated. There are two main schools of thought, however. One is that she was born in around 1501, the other is that she was born in roughly 1507. In order to understand how these two potential dates have been arrived at and why there is such disagreement over them, it's necessary first to understand the chronology of Anne's life, for though the year of her birth is contested, the dates of many other events are more or less accepted. She spent her early years here, at her family's fairy tale home, Hever Castle in Kent. In 1513, however, she boarded a ship and left England for the Low Countries, which is now modern-day Belgium. Her destination was the Palace of Mechlin in Brabant, parts of which still look much the same today as they did when Anne was there. She was residing at the court of the twice-widowed Margaret, Archduchess of Austria, an unusually powerful woman for the time, who was then the governor of the Habsburg Netherlands. This turned out to be quite a short pit stop though, as in late 1514 Anne was on the move again, this time to France to join the household of her future sister-in-law, the 18-year-old Mary Tudor. This was during Mary's spectacularly brief tenure as Queen of that country, which came to an abrupt end after less than 3 months when her husband Louis XII died, having supposedly exerted himself a little too much with his new wife. Mary, though, had a knack, much like her brother Henry VIII, of knowing exactly who she wanted to marry, and not much caring about the mess that following through on her desires would cause. And so it was that barely 9 weeks later she married the man you see her with here, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. Did she have the permission of her brother to contract this new marriage with a man of much lower rank than she? No, she did not, and that went down with Henry about as well as a lead balloon. So while she and Brandon returned home to face the music with the king, who eventually forgave them after a grovelling and exceptionally expensive apology, Anne stayed behind and transferred to the household of Mary's successor and stepdaughter, Queen Claude, in 1515. She only returned to England herself in late 1521 or early 1522, at which point there were plans afoot to marry her off to her Irish relative, James Butler. These plans ultimately fell through, however, and although Anne also caught the eye of Henry Percy, later Earl of Northumberland, and counted the poet Thomas Wyatt among her other admirers, as we know, she was, fatefully, still unmarried when she came to the attention of the king. When exactly this happened is unclear, but it's generally attributed to 1525 or 1526. After a lengthy courtship, during which Henry fought to rid himself of his completely unoffending and long-suffering first wife, the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, Anne and Henry supposedly went through a secret marriage ceremony on the 14th of November 1532. This was all very hush-hush, however, so we can't actually be 100% sure that it happened. There was another slightly more public ceremony at the end of January 1533. Their daughter Elizabeth was born that September, and indeed this could be why a story of a marriage in November was put out, as Anne was obviously already pregnant by the end of January, and saying they were married when she conceived was less scandalous. Less than 3 years after Elizabeth's arrival, and after 2 further miscarriages and accusations of adultery and treason, Anne was beheaded on the 19th of May, 1536. These events therefore provide a timeline within which we can work to start to think about why Anne's birth is variously reported as 1501 or 1507. The former is supported by several of her main biographers, including Eric Ives, David Starkey and Antonia Fraser. They, and those who agree with them, point to the fact that Anne was described as being 15 when she went to France in 1514 and about 20 when she returned to England in the early 1520s. She was also sent to Margaret of Austria to become, according to Ives, a fille d'honneur, or a maid of honour, and the minimum age for a position of this nature was 12 or 13. Ives also argues that she was a maid of honour to Queens Mary and Claude of France, again a position much more fitting for a girl of around 14 than a child of no more than 8. The modern historian leading the pack for a birth year of circa 1507 is Retha Warnick, and she also cites a number of sources. First, there is a comment in an early 17th century biography of a lady by the name of Jane Dormer that Anne was not 29 years of age at the time of her death here at the Tower. This comment has led some, naturally enough, to extrapolate a supposed birthday of late May or June in the year 1507. What makes Jane interesting as a source is that although she was born 2 years after Anne's death, she went on to become a favoured lady-in-waiting to this woman, Anne's stepdaughter Mary I, and it's presumed that this is where she obtained her knowledge of Anne's age. After Mary's death in 1558, Jane went on to marry a Spanish nobleman, becoming the Duchess of Feria, and moved to the continent. In her old age, she dictated her memoirs to one Henry Clifford before dying in 1612. Warnick also points to the fact that, completely independently of Jane Dormer, the year 1507 was also put forward by the English writer William Camden in his book Annals Rerum Anglicarum et Hibernicarum Regnante Elizabetha. This was first published in 1615, and it is in a marginal note in Latin that the comment Anne Boleyna nata MD VII was made, meaning Anne Boleyn, born 1507. Camden had been commissioned to write this history of the reign of Elizabeth in the 1590s, and as well as having the use of the state archives, he was given access to the personal archives of this man, William Cecil Baron Burghley, who was one of Elizabeth's great favourites. There is no doubt, therefore, that he had some excellent sources at his disposal, many of which have surely been lost in the intervening centuries. Finally, there's this man, John Weaver. In 1631, he published the book you see here entitled Ancient Funeral Monuments, in which he claimed that Anne was 16 years younger than Henry. As Henry was most definitely born in 1491, this once again supports a birth year for Anne of 1507. Crucially, Retha Warnick does not contest the idea that Anne was on the continent in 1513, but argues that she was sent there aged 6 by her parents for her education, and that she was not a maid of honour, but rather a child being raised alongside the numerous other children Margaret of Austria was responsible for. Similarly, she argues that Anne was placed in the schoolroom in France with some of Mary Tudor's new in-laws and stayed there during Queen Claude's early years as queen, only becoming a maid of honour in 1519 at the age of 12. Warnick also feels it is unlikely that Anne's age would not have aroused greater comment had she really been 32 at the time of her daughter Elizabeth's birth in 1533, as this was relatively old for the time period. There is another piece of the puzzle which needs to be added to Anne's timeline, however, for in 1513 or 1514, while living with Margaret of Austria, she wrote a letter in French to her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn. The letter is now held at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, and when translated, reads as follows. Sir, I understand by your letter that you desire that I shall be a worthy woman when I come to the court, and you inform me that the Queen, meaning Catherine of Aragon, will take the trouble to converse with me, which rejoices me much to think of talking with a person so wise and worthy. This will make me have greater desire to continue to speak French well and also spell, especially because you have so enjoined it on me, and with my own hand I inform you that I will observe it the best I can. Sir, I beg you to excuse me if my letter is badly written, for I assure you that the orthography is from my own understanding alone, while the others were only written by my hand, and Semenet, who is her tutor, tells me the letter, but waits so that I may do it myself, for fear that it shall not be known unless I acquaint you. And I pray you that the light of, and this next word is unclear, may not be allowed to drive away the will which you say you have to help me. For it seems to me that you are sure, another unclear word, you can, if you please, make me a declaration of your word, and concerning me be certain that there shall be neither, unclear word, nor ingratitude, which might check or efface my affection, which is determined to, unclear word, as much unless it shall please you to order me. And I promise you that my love is based on such great strength that it will never grow less, and I will make an end to my, another unclear word, but probably letter, after having commended myself right humbly to your good grace. Written at Veur by your very humble and very obedient daughter, Anne Boleyn, and she signs her name in the French style. This letter was only dated to Anne's time in the Low Countries in 1981 by the historian Hugh Paget, and crucially neither the 1501 nor the 1507 camp challenged this dating. Instead, they debate how old Anne was when she wrote it. Now, if you look at the letter on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see that the handwriting is neat and that the gaps between words and lines are fairly uniform, despite the fact that there are no lines on the paper to act as a guide. Anne even takes a space to separate out her farewell comment and signature. The supporters of 1501 argue that these traits indicate the work of at least a 12 or 13-year-old. They also point to the fact that Anne is writing in her second language. Now, admittedly, her French is atrocious. The spelling is highly phonetic, as you've just heard. Some words remain unintelligible to this day, and even Anne herself apologised for its errors. Still, say the advocates of a 1501 birth date, the feat of composing a letter of this quality at all would be too much for a child of 6 or 7. Those arguing for 1507, however, see things differently, and state that it could indeed have been written by a young child. Retha Warnick also contends that Anne's comment that her tutor was teaching her to write French indicates that she was still in the schoolroom. Furthermore, she points to a remark made by Thomas Boleyn in 1514. When he wrote to ask Margaret of Austria to send Anne to France to wait on Mary Tudor, he referred to Anne as La Petite Boleyn, or the Little Boleyn. Warnick feels that he would not have used this phrase to describe his daughter if she was in fact 13 or 14 years old at the time, as this would have made her old enough to be married by the standards of the day. Nor do later comments on her appearance suggest that Anne was of particularly short stature, so Warnick does not believe that even at 13, and likely before her final growth spurts would have happened, she would have been described as little due to her height. Other evidence is more circumstantial. The content of Anne's letter to her father might suggest an older girl in her early teens rather than a child, for Anne talks about becoming a woman of good reputation and being allowed to talk to the Queen, and uses the word orthography. This language, even if it was dictated to her by her tutor, feels very mature to come from a 6 or 7-year-old, and she would have been very young to be presented to and taken notice of by Catherine of Aragon, though perhaps this was a promise of a treat intended to take place a number of years down the line. Henry VIII was also famously desperate for a son and believed by 1536 that Anne couldn't give him one, despite the fact that she'd fallen pregnant at least 3 times between late 1532 and late 1535, though only Elizabeth had been born alive. His fear that she couldn't produce another living child arguably makes more sense if she was around 35 years old at the time of her death, rather than 28 or 29. This is especially true when we consider that her successor in his affections, Jane Seymour, was apparently around 27 in 1536. As for the comments that Anne was around 15 when she went to France in 1514 and 20 in 1521 when she returned to England, let's take a look at these in more detail. The first comes from a comment made by a man called Nicholas Sander. In a book he wrote entitled The Rise and Growth of the Anglican Schism, which was published posthumously in 1585, he said that, "At 15 she sinned first with her father's butler, and then with his chaplain, and forthwith was sent to France and placed at the expense of the king under the care of a certain nobleman not far from Brie. Soon afterwards she appeared at the French court." Now, as we've already seen, Anne went first to the Low Countries in 1513 before she took up residence in France, though she may well have travelled through France to get to Mechlin. There's no mention of her time with Margaret of Austria here, though, and no suggestion elsewhere that she was maintained on the continent at the expense of the king, which would suggest Henry VIII. Sander also indicates that these supposed indiscretions with her father's staff were common knowledge even to Henry. Sander, however, is a deeply problematic source. He never knew Anne, he was a Catholic recusant living in exile on the continent during the reign of her daughter, and he was heavily biased against both women, to the point that it's hard to take anything he says as truth. His entire book is essentially a diatribe against Elizabeth, Anne, and Protestantism more generally. Moving on to the second comment that Anne was 20 when she returned from France in late 1521 or early 1522. This comes from a book written by Edward Herbert, Baron Cherbury, and again it was published posthumously, this time in 1649. Here we can see the relevant snippet from the actual book. The first thing to draw your attention to is the little 1520 in the margin, which I've highlighted in yellow. This is Herbert saying that Anne was still in France in this year. Then in the main text a little bit lower down, he says of her that, at last being come hither, meaning having arrived back in England from France, and about the 20th year of her age, received into our Queen's service. This would suggest that she was 20 when she came back to England. However, look at the margin again. Herbert has specifically stated that his information has come from Camden, who we know said that Anne was born in 1507. Herbert's writing style isn't particularly clear in this passage, but what he actually seems to be saying is that Anne returned from the continent, which we know took place in late 1521 or early 1522, and then, sometime later, when she was about 20, she joined Catherine of Aragon's household. This then raises the question of when did she enter the Queen's service? Unfortunately, as with so much of Anne's life, there is no solid date here, but her involvement with Henry Percy apparently took place during this time and was certainly over by the end of 1523, as Percy was married to a woman by the name of Mary Talbot in March 1524. Herbert is therefore saying that Anne was around 20 no later than 1523, all the while citing Camden, who says she would have been no more than 16 at this point. Basically, Herbert's work can be used to argue either side of this debate, especially as the phrase about the 20th year of her age indicates a margin of error of probably a couple of years. As for that comment by John Weaver that Anne was 16 years younger than Henry, the fact that he was writing in 1631 and likely had access to Dormer and or Camden's writings strongly suggests to me that his assertions were no more than a rehash of what they had said. So what conclusions can we draw from this debate and from the evidence underpinning it? Personally, I lean towards a birth date of around 1501. For me, the letter is the real clincher, as I agree with Ives and his adherents that the handwriting and tone are not that of a 7-year-old child, let alone a child writing in their second language. For further evidence of this, I encourage you to do a quick Google search for handwriting of a 7-year-old and take a look at the results, most of which are nowhere near as competent as Anne's letter, despite having lines on the page to help with proper spacing. I also agree that Anne joined the households of Margaret of Austria, Mary Tudor and Queen Claude as a maid of honour, and not simply to learn French or other schoolgirl subjects, which she could have done in England. Regarding the later contentions that Anne was younger, I'm sceptical for a number of reasons. First and foremost, people like Jane Dormer and William Camden lived and wrote decades after Anne's death, and they didn't know her themselves. Jane's evidence was presumably based on a comment made by Mary Tudor years after Anne's demise, and Jane then recalled this information many decades later. Nor did she publish her own life story. Henry Clifford did, thereby creating further opportunities for mistakes to creep into the narrative. There are simply too many people and too many long intervals in this chain of evidence for my liking. Nevertheless, the fact that Dormer and Camden both came up with the year 1507 as Anne's birth year, and that Camden had access to an impressive array of sources, cannot be ignored. My explanation for this, however, is quite simple. I think there's a good chance that Anne lied about her age to those who knew her in England in the 1520s and 30s, and that this is the ultimate source of the information or misinformation provided by Dormer and Camden. In an era before birth certificates, it is even possible that Anne was genuinely unsure of her exact age and made an error, though I doubt she would have been out by as much as 6 years, especially with her parents on hand to ask. If she told people she was significantly younger than she really was, I think it was a deliberate move on her part, and an understandable one at that. The fact is that by the time she was proposed to by Henry, became his acknowledged wife in 1533, and gave birth to Elizabeth that September, she was old by the standards of the day, and it was in her best interests to try to disguise this fact. She could never have guessed that a letter she wrote to her father in 1513 or 1514 would show up to muddy the waters and throw aspersions on the idea that she was born several years later than she really was. Nor could she have known that anyone would care. As for the comment made by Thomas Boleyn that Anne was the little Boleyn, I believe that she was younger than her sister Mary, though we could have an entirely different video on the relative ages of the two girls and whether Mary was older or younger, and that this may account for the moniker of La Petite Boleyn. Alternatively, it could simply have been a pet name given by a father to his daughter. So now that you've seen and heard all the evidence for yourself, what do you think? 1501 or 1507? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below, and I'll leave links in the description box to my other videos on Henry's wives. If you'd like to learn more about any of them, I'll also leave links to my favourite books, movies, TV shows and documentaries about Henry and his queens. Remember to make sure you're subscribed with notifications switched on so that you don't miss next week's video on Jane Seymour and whether or not she stole Henry from Anne. Till then, keep learning.